Straight ahead, a look at the history and development of jazz, the uniquely American music that began with black musicians in New Orleans. Also, a visit with some of the members of Creole Incorporated in Lafayette, an organization dedicated to the preservation of the culture of Creoles of color. All in today's edition of Folks. Hello everyone and welcome to Folks. I'm Sonya Masingale. Many ethnomusicologists say that jazz was developed in the general southern part of the United States, but serious jazz scholars tell us that the true birthplace of jazz music was right here in our own backyard in New Orleans. On today's Pause for Pride, our special Black History Month series, we take a look at how jazz music began. New Orleans is the home for many unique cultural contributions: Creole cooking, American Mardi Gras, and jazz. At least that's the theory many serious music scholars tell us.
One of the problems or issues that we deal with, however, is that since the mid-1940s, there's been a point of view which ascribes the origins of jazz generally throughout the South, and some people would even say New York. They point elsewhere. We tend to disagree with that because we've got, amongst other things here, 1,500 reels of oral history interview with pioneer jazzmen, people who were born in the late 19th century and began their active musical careers either late in the 19th century or early in the 20th century. And they give very positive indication that jazz is something that developed out of a regional and highly distinctive musical culture in New Orleans. A culture which was remarkably different from places like New York and Chicago, where jazz ultimately developed farther down the line. But I'm absolutely convinced in my research that New Orleans was the birthplace of jazz, and that this is a topic which really needs serious attention. No one would claim that boogie-woogie piano style, which was a kind of parallel form of hot music to jazz, was born in New Orleans, although actually some writers have, and Downbeat mistakenly made this claim. For the same reason, what we're saying is that the idiom that started jazz began in New Orleans. However, once it left town, it began to change very rapidly. And so a lot of people, if they take jazz from the late 1920s, like Duke Ellington, and try to look for the roots of that, well, New Orleans are not really the proper roots of Duke Ellington, but they are the roots of King Oliver, the original Dixieland Jazz Band, Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five, and the original impulse of jazz. But jazz changed dramatically once it became nationally and internationally recognized.
The acknowledged father of jazz music is Buddy Bolden. Since there is no known recording of Bolden's music, we must rely on historical lore to explain his impact on the world of music.
Well, Bolden was an exponent of what is usually referred to as the Uptown Blacks, these being largely one would hesitate to say untrained musicians, but they did not receive the kind of formal training that was typical, say, within Creole of color society, which had very strong French cultural connections. People like Sidney Bechet and Freddie Keppard emerged from this society, although we'll see that Bolden affected the direction that their musical studies took dramatically. But Bolden was known as an extremely forceful cornetist. It was said that he could be heard 5 miles away. Of course, they didn't have the distraction of automobile sounds and so many of the modern noises that are typical today. And it may be apocryphal, but the point is that no one doubts the power of this man on trumpet and his expressiveness. So if we look for the root of jazz and we try to find one characteristic out of Bolden which would probably account for this, it would be his improvisational character to his playing. The power of his playing, the blues tinging of his playing. Kid Ory, for example, said that Most of the influence that led Bolden in this direction actually came from the Pentecostal church, from the Holy Rollers, and that he was taking what he heard in the church and translating it to the cabaret and street audiences for whom he played.
Here, jazz musician and scholar Alvin Batiste directs the Southern University Jazz Ensemble in an example of how Bolden's early music may have sounded.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1.
One of the interesting points is what happened to the music when it began to emerge from the black community in an era which was certainly racist, that shortly after sees a resurgence of Klan power throughout the country, an expansion of the Klan, that had military induction tests that were racially biased. What is surprising is what kind of response came from virtually the entire ethnic and racial community in New Orleans to, say, the impulse associated with Bolden. John Robichaud, for example, was a popular Creole of color band leader who had probably the #1 band in town, known for its finesse and its expertise. Ultimately, they became the backup band for Bessie Smith and other Toba artists who went through the Lyric Theater in the early 1920s. But Robichaud found himself continuously in cutting contests with the Bolden band and kept losing. So he ultimately decided that the only way he could maintain his popularity was to sort of capitulate to the public demand for hotter styles. And he began hiring hot cornet players to sort of pepper up his bands.
Storyville, the infamous red light district, played an important role in the development of jazz music. It was here that musicians such as Jelly Roll Morton developed their distinctive styles of music.
When American jazz scholarship began in the 1930s in earnest, a great deal of the early history of jazz was attributed to the impact of Storyville. Writers like Al Rose, in his book on Storyville, pointed out that jazz probably existed before Storyville was consolidated through the legislation, and that it was already leaving town before Storyville was closed in 1917. The terminology of the Jazz Age is probably most correctly applied to the general American national reaction to jazz following its first recordings by the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917. Once jazz became a national mania, it fit in with the flapper trends, prohibition, the general generation gap and rebellion against Victorian standards of morality, the Model T is a kind of bedroom on wheels. All these things, jazz seemed to be the perfect theme song for this youthful rebellion. And so Americans, of course, not only accepted it as part of this youthful rebellion, but reacted against it as a threat because it was perhaps the easiest scapegoat, particularly considering its supposed origins, for the backlash against this kind of social change.
That jazz was most often heard in establishments of ill repute may have been one of the reasons that it was considered socially unacceptable by much of mainstream society. However, the popularity of the music continued to spread throughout America. Would you say the evolution of jazz music parallels the evolution of integration in America?
I think that even more than paralleling it, it set the pace for it. In 1923, the Jeanette recording session with the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, which was primarily a New Orleans band. Like other New Orleans bands, it was made up of New Orleans players who actually organized elsewhere, in this case in Chicago, very much like King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band had done. But Morton was brought into the Jeanette studios in 1923 and made several songs with the Rhythm Kings. This was the first integrated recording session that we know about, and it occurred in Richmond, Indiana, the seat of the Star Piano Company, which was at the time undergoing a resurgence of Klan activity. So let's just say that not everybody in Indiana, the owners of the Jeanette record company, saw the possibilities that existed and were willing to take advantage of them. What I mean to suggest here is that within the jazz world, the color line existed, but it was porous, that it could be traversed, and there were plenty of people on both sides who saw good reason for getting around the color line, and they would go to great lengths to find excuses to play together or to, say, put one over on the white authorities so that they wouldn't know that here was a white man traveling with a black band or vice versa, which, of course, was a no-no in the South, even beyond the Second World War period.
Until recently, jazz musicians have had to leave the United States in order to make a living wage. Why is it that jazz is still the least commercially viable music in America?
The very fact that it was black music makes it problematical for a broader middle-class audience. Many people have transcended this, obviously, but let's just say that by the time rock and roll came around in the 1950s, they still thought that it was necessary to take Fats Domino records and have Pat Boone cover them. And so who makes the money? Pat Boone. Fats Domino might get some composer royalties, and ultimately certainly did make it on his own. But you can see how timorous the record companies are in trying to introduce black music to a white public. Now, they had already done so for years, but they were always very conservative about it, always worried about it getting out of control. That's one point. Second is, jazz music started off with a dance craze in a record sales boom coming out of 1938. It might have started with Vernon and Irene Castle based on ragtime and society-type syncopations, but ultimately after 1917, the main thrust of this boom, lasting almost to the end of the decade, was with jazz records and jazz sales, which became the new hot music, the Black Bottom, the Big Apple, the Charleston, you name it. These were essentially Southern dances, in many cases, that had been translated to Northern ballrooms for the fun of the sons and daughters of the scions and the middle class.
In spite of its struggle to survive, jazz music remains one of America's strongest cultural icons. Recently, jazz received a boost in popularity in the United States and the world. Ironically, the new interest in jazz was stimulated for the most part by New Orleans native Wynton Marsalis. Southern University in Baton Rouge is doing its part to preserve and develop the great American tradition of jazz through the Jazz Institute.
The Jazz Institute at Southern University is extremely important because it's one of the few times in the history of music in the Western world where you can have an education system that is dealing with people in an indigenous situation and at the same time offer the legacy of knowledge in music per se to them at the same time. You traditionally have this type of configuration when you're dealing with the graduate level in the sciences and in public administration and politics and what have you. But to have people whose legacy is the actual creation of the music in an educational environment where the legacy of knowledge is very, it's a breakthrough. We are applying for accreditation by the appropriate boards in the state of Louisiana to become a Jazz Institute and Louisiana music program. What that will have the effect of doing is making many young musicians immune to the dichotomization of musical product in the future. Say, for instance, many jazz musicians have had to become singers or rock and roll singers in order to survive in the market. On the other hand, there have been many rock and roll singers who would like to have sung jazz, like Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, Chaka Khan, but they had to continue on in their field. And the wheel of music, the African-American music, jazz is one of the spokes on the wheel, just as blues and gospel, and of course, products that industry created like rock and roll and pop and crossover. Those are not really aesthetic entities, they are market entities. And when you realize the impact that technology and very mature systems of marketing and influencing the minds of people and guiding public opinion, you can see the problem that young musicians would have as they evolve from their indigenous experience and partake of the legacy of knowledge. So we envision a program that will remove these artificial boundaries so that they can have a broad perspective of music and then opt for choices based on the conditions that they have to function in or what their real heartfelt desire is.
Through the music of Alvin Batiste, we can see the scholarly study of jazz has evolved into an aesthetic yet pleasing phenomenon.
Knowledge is power, every hour. You stop keeping up, and you fall back. Pain and rain, I do the same. I want to feel good when I can. I like to walk, I like to talk. I want plenty knowledge, and at the dark. Knowledge is power, every hour. You stop keeping up, and you fall back. It's good to have a party and have a lot of fun, but life is so easy, and you can't be taught it. Knowledge is power, every hour. You stop keeping up, and you fall back. Knowledge is power, every hour. You stop keeping up, and you fall back.
If you're interested in learning more about Louisiana's contribution to jazz, please contact the Hogan Jazz Archive, Howard Tilton Memorial Library at Tulane University in New Orleans. Our next feature introduces us to some of the members of Creole Incorporated, an organization dedicated to preserving the culture of Creoles of color. The group began when several of the charter members noticed the tendency to lump anything French under the Cajun umbrella. We find that the members of this group are promoting Louisiana's Creole culture in the most positive way. At one time in Louisiana history, Creoles of color saw themselves as separate and different from other African Americans. John and Marlene Broussard, charter members of Creole Incorporated in Lafayette, represent the coming of age of Louisiana's African American Creoles. You can see from the lovely black art in their home they are comfortable with being French-speaking African Americans, and Creole Inc. is all about bringing people together.
The group, the organization, the meetings that we attend are very joyful. We have a very good relationship. We get along great with each other. But one of the main things that I'm interested in Creole was just kind of seeking out our roots and kind of finding out exactly where we're from, where all of this is coming from. Because it was quite interesting that this past summer with the exchange program that the chaperone was Marez from Guadeloupe, and having a conversation with her, I always like to tell people my maiden name is St. Julian, and I told her that I was a St. Julian, and she said, well, you know, my great-grandmother is a St. Julian. And I found that that was quite interesting because she was all the way from Guadeloupe, visiting in Louisiana, and here I met someone whose grandmother was a St. Julian. And so I think being as a member of this organization is that we're meeting people from different islands and different countries, and we're learning about their background.
I've had the opportunity to visit with, not away from this, but visit with the various visitors from the various countries. Africa, for an example. Recently there were some 6 or 8 journalists that were here. And because of the existence and the knowledge of Creole organization, we were involved, and we were invited to be involved into the sponsoring of the visitors here and to show them some of the culture, the Creole culture in this area. And in fact, it appeared that when they met us and we took over and showed them, they felt so relaxed with us and so welcome. And in fact, we had them here as part of Creole, as an entertainment to them at this house here. And they felt so welcome here in this country. And by Creole and the organization as we are, and the group of people that we are that came together. And even we're inviting people to come in and join with us to let them see what we're all about. And that all we want to do is to be able to identify ourselves as a race or as a group of people.
We're also finding out that we have a lot of things in common with the people from the different islands. We have a friend that we met by the name of George, and he's from Haiti. And whenever George visits with us, we sit down and we have what is called a tea-compte. And we talk about things that, as we grew up as children, what some of our parents would do with us for remedies for different sicknesses, and we call it the tea-compte. And it's quite interesting that some of the same things that we talk about with George, about things that our parents would do for us, he has also had the very same experience in Haiti.
Creole is personally my baby, but I think for the group it's, as I told one of the members, I think it's more than really what we had bargained for, which is really good. It's a positive point, I think. We have aspired to do a number of things, realized a number of things that I don't think we had even thought it was going to actually take place. My involvement goes back several years. Again, things just happen through conversation, and then it was left alone, and then Paul and I talked about some mechanism, something that we could use to focus on our culture. Yeah, and that we knew that we weren't Cajuns, and that seemed to have been what everybody wanted us to be, and this is what we were hearing. And what could we do to accentuate the blacks in this area, and to say that you do have a place, you merit something, and to bring them together. You know, although we weren't looking for a separate. Are being separate from any other culture. But there were things in our culture that we wanted to see happen or just expressed more. So we got other folks involved. We started talking, and we formed the group Creole.
We're anticipating on doing a number of things. We want to continue our relationship with and expand our relationship with the cultural exchange programs. We have been providing a dialogue for other individual, I hate to use the term dignitaries, but individuals who come from another country who offer something unique that's pretty similar to our culture, and we have opportunities to dialogue and make what I said, our main goal to improve communication, and that's one of the things that we're really working on. We have been incorporated, by the way, as Creole Inc. officially, and we have a flag that we've adopted. The group has adopted. we have a lot of things that we're excited about, and I don't know if if I can think that clearly right now to get into or give you the main all the things that we're trying to accomplish. But as long as we are in the business of promoting, in the business of making the public aware that we are a viable organization who want to make this contribution to society, to mankind.
And it's just a good thing to know that you have a place where you belong.
More information on Creole Incorporated is available by contacting the address on your screen or by calling 318-232-9076. Well, that's all for today's program. Remember, Black History Month is not an end into itself. The idea is to write the true story of America and the world, to include the contributions of all people of color to world civilization. See you next week. Bye-bye.